The snow fell heavily on the Eastern Front that December morning in 1941, but Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was not thinking about the Russian winter. His attention was fixed on a decoded intelligence report that had arrived from Berlin, a single sheet of paper that changed every calculation the Wehrmacht had made about victory. The Americans had entered the war. Adolf Hitler had assured his generals that the United States would never fight, that the mongrel democracy was too weak, too divided, too soft to challenge the Third Reich. Even if they did enter the conflict, the Führer insisted, their hodgepodge army of factory workers and farmers would require years to become combat effective. By then, Germany would control everything from the Atlantic to the Urals, and America would sue for peace rather than assault Fortress Europe. Von Rundstedt knew better. He had studied the previous war, had pored over after-action reports from 1918, had interviewed officers who had witnessed American industrial power firsthand. He understood what was coming, even if Hitler did not. The nightmare was about to repeat itself, only this time on a scale that would make the Great War seem almost quaint by comparison. General Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, sat in his Berlin office, surrounded by maps that documented Germany's greatest triumphs. Poland crushed in weeks, France defeated in 6 weeks, Yugoslavia and Greece overrun. The Wehrmacht had written a new chapter in military history, proving that speed, coordination, and audacity could overcome numerical superiority. Blitzkrieg had rendered the old arithmetic of warfare obsolete, or so they had believed. The first reports from North Africa suggested something troubling. American units were arriving in Operation Torch, and while their performance was initially clumsy, Kesselring Pass had been an embarrassing rout, the sheer quantity of equipment they brought was staggering. General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, sent dispatches that read less like military reports and more like industrial surveys. The Americans had tanks in such numbers that losing 50 seemed to concern them not at all. They would attack the same position 3, 4, 5 times, absorbing casualties that would have depleted a German division, then return the next morning with fresh units. Rommel understood combined arms warfare better than perhaps any commander alive. He had perfected the art of the armored thrust, the coordinated dance of tanks, artillery, and infantry that could tear through enemy defenses like a blade through silk. But the Americans were not playing the same game. They approached war like engineers solving a problem, applying resources until the obstacle ceased to exist. Where German panzer commanders husbanded their precious tanks, knowing each loss was irreplaceable, American armor commanders expended Shermans with apparent indifference, secure in the knowledge that factories in Detroit were producing more even as the battles raged. By 1943, the pattern had become unmistakable. General Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored warfare, reviewed production figures with growing despair. Germany was manufacturing approximately 1,000 tanks per month, straining its industrial capacity to the absolute limit. American factories were producing 2,000 tanks per month and accelerating. German aircraft production peaked at around 40,000 planes for the entire war. America would build over 300,000. The numbers seemed absurd, impossible. Surely no nation, however wealthy, could sustain such production rates. Surely the reports were exaggerated, inflated by Allied propaganda or intelligence errors. But the evidence kept mounting. American bomber formations grew larger with each passing month. 1,000-plane raids became routine. The Luftwaffe shot down dozens, scores, sometimes hundreds of aircraft, and the Americans simply built more. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding forces in Italy, experienced America's endless army as a physical phenomenon. After the landings at Anzio and Salerno, German counterattacks had initially pushed the Allies back, demonstrating the Wehrmacht's continued tactical superiority. But the Americans never retreated far, never broke, never ran out of ammunition or reinforcements. They established beachheads and fed men and material into them like coal into a furnace, creating an inexorable pressure that German forces could slow but never stop. Kesselring was a brilliant defensive commander, a master of prepared positions and fighting withdrawals. He turned Italy's mountainous terrain into a fortress, creating defensive lines that should have held for years. Yet the Americans ground forward, not through tactical brilliance, but through relentless pressure. They brought artillery in quantities that turned entire mountainsides into moonscapes. They replaced shattered divisions with fresh ones arriving directly from training camps in America. They fought with a patient, methodical determination that made German tactical victories meaningless. The German generals gathered in situation rooms and tried to solve an unsolvable problem. How do you defeat an enemy who can lose every battle and still win the war? The Wehrmacht excelled at maneuver warfare, at encirclements and breakthrough operations. But such tactics required an enemy who could be exhausted, whose reserves could be depleted. The Americans had no bottom to their reserves. General Johannes Blaskowitz, defending France, received intelligence briefings about the build-up in England that defied comprehension. Over 1 million American soldiers were staging in Britain, preparing for the invasion everyone knew was coming. The Atlantic Wall stretched from Norway to Spain, a massive fortification system that had consumed years of labor and mountains of concrete and steel. Hitler proclaimed it impregnable. Blaskowitz knew better. He had seen the reconnaissance photographs, the aerial surveys of English ports where American ships arrived in convoys so large they blackened the horizon. Liberty ships, manufactured in American shipyards at a rate of 3 per day, each carrying enough supplies to sustain a small army. Landing craft by the thousands, purpose-built for amphibious assault. The invasion, when it came, would not be a raid or a probe. It would be an industrial operation, warfare reduced to logistics and executed with assembly line precision. D-Day confirmed every fear. Field Marshal Rommel, now commanding Army Group B in France, watched the landings with professional horror. The Allies came ashore with a coordination and force that overwhelmed German defenses through sheer mass. When panzer divisions counterattacked, they found themselves targeted by naval gunfire of apocalyptic intensity. Battleships and cruisers offshore fired shells as large as automobiles, turning entire villages into rubble. Allied aircraft swarmed overhead in formations so dense they blocked the sun. The German response was tactically sound and strategically irrelevant. Panzer units maneuvered brilliantly, achieving local victories, destroying Allied armor at favorable exchange ratios. None of it mattered. For every American tank destroyed, 2 more appeared. For every position successfully defended, the Americans simply attacked elsewhere, using their overwhelming numbers to find weak points and exploit them. General Gunther von Kluge, taking command in France after Rommel's injury, inherited an impossible situation. His forces were outnumbered, outgunned, and strangled by Allied air superiority so complete that German units could barely move in daylight. Supply convoys were obliterated before reaching the front. Reinforcements arrived as shattered remnants, their strength bled away during the journey. Von Kluge was a skilled professional, a veteran of campaigns from Poland to Russia. He understood that Germany was losing not because its soldiers were inferior. Man for man, the Wehrmacht remained a formidable fighting force, but because the Americans had transformed war into a production problem. They manufactured soldiers the way they manufactured automobiles, processing recruits through standardized training programs and shipping them to Europe in a never-ending stream. The Battle of the Bulge represented Germany's last desperate gamble, a massive counter-offensive designed to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The initial assault achieved surprise and drove deep into American lines. For a few glorious days, It seemed the Wehrmacht had rediscovered its old magic, that speed and audacity might yet overcome numerical superiority. Then reality reasserted itself. American forces bent, but did not break. Surrounded units at Bastogne held out, supplied by airlift. Within days, the entire American war machine pivoted, redirecting divisions from across Europe to seal the breakthrough. What would have taken the Wehrmacht weeks to coordinate, the Americans accomplished in 72 hours. Entire armies changed direction, supply lines rerouted, fresh divisions thrown into battle with a speed that defied German comprehension. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army during the offensive, watched his carefully hoarded armored reserves bleed away against an enemy that could absorb losses he could not afford to inflict. His tanks ran out of fuel because German supply lines had collapsed. American tanks kept fighting because somewhere across the Atlantic, refineries in Texas were pumping petroleum that tankers carried to Europe in quantities sufficient to fuel entire mechanized armies. By early 1945, the situation had become apocalyptic. Field Marshal Walter Model, trapped in the Ruhr Pocket, commanded forces that still fought with skill and determination, but could not overcome the basic arithmetic of annihilation. American armies surrounded the pocket and simply waited, knowing that time and ammunition favored them absolutely. German soldiers fired carefully, rationing bullets that would never be replaced. American infantry expended ammunition freely, knowing supply trucks would arrive before nightfall carrying more. Model, perhaps the Wehrmacht's finest defensive tactician, understood that he was watching the end of a military tradition. The German General Staff had spent generations refining the art of war, studying campaigns from Frederick the Great to von Moltke, developing doctrine that emphasized maneuver, concentration of force, and economy of effort. All of it had become obsolete in the face of an enemy who treated entire armies as expendable resources. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the Wehrmacht, sat through briefings where the numbers told a story of systematic destruction. Germany had mobilized brilliantly, extracting every possible soldier from its population, turning its entire economy toward war production. It was not enough. America fought with one hand, dedicating only a fraction of its industrial capacity to the European theater while simultaneously waging war across the Pacific. And still they produced more, supplied more, reinforced more than Germany could match. The American soldiers themselves often seemed almost beside the point. They were competent but rarely brilliant, well supplied but not particularly aggressive, adequately trained but lacking the refined tactical skills of German veterans. Yet they won anyway, not through superior combat performance, but through the simple, terrible logic of industrial attrition. They attacked, not when conditions were optimal, but when supply schedules permitted. They captured objectives not through elegant maneuver, but through firepower so overwhelming that defense became impossible. In the final days, as Soviet and American forces carved Germany into occupation zones, the surviving German generals confronted what their predecessors had learned in 1918. Modern warfare belonged to those who could sustain production, not those who fought most skillfully. America's endless army had proven that industrial capacity trumped military tradition, that factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh were more decisive than all the tactical brilliance the Wehrmacht could muster. The lesson was burned into German military consciousness, a bitter understanding that in the age of total war, victory belonged not to the most skilled armies, but to the most productive economies. The Wehrmacht had been a magnificent instrument of war, perhaps the most professionally competent military force in history. But it had faced an opponent who treated war as an industrial process and possessed the resources to run that process until Germany's capacity for resistance was ground to dust. America's endless army had not defeated Germany through superior tactics or generalship. It had defeated Germany by existing, by representing an inexhaustible reserve of men and material that could absorb any loss and continue advancing. In that cold calculus, all the Wehrmacht's skill and courage had been rendered ultimately meaningless, swept away by the assembly lines that never stopped running.